Before we begin this journey together, take a moment to settle into wherever you are right now. Let the noise of the day grow quieter. Adjust your headphones if you are wearing them. Allow your breathing to slow just enough that you can feel the ideas we are about to explore land inside you, rather than simply pass over you. The audiobook you are listening to carries a simple yet profound promise. Your life, in its smallest daily choices and its largest turning points, is being shaped by something you rarely question. That something is the continuous stream of thoughts moving through your mind, most of them operating far below the level of your ordinary awareness. What you are about to hear will show you how those thoughts have been quietly writing the rules of your reality for years, and how you can begin to change the rules themselves. Consider, for just a moment, the possibility that the version of you reading these words, the one who feels certain limits around what is possible, who sometimes hesitates before speaking up or trying something new, who carries a quiet sense that some doors are open for other people but not quite for you, may not be the real you at all. It may simply be the you that your mind has been trained to expect. What of the reason certain patterns keep repeating in your relationships, your work, or your sense of what you deserve is not because the world is fixed against you, but because an older version of your thinking is still running the show? This is not a comfortable question, yet it is the question that opens the door to everything that follows. Most people never ask it. They assume their thoughts are reactions to life rather than the hidden architects of it. They move through their days convinced that their personality, their past, or their circumstances are the final explanation for why things feel the way they do. What you are about to discover is that those explanations are often only the surface. Beneath them lies a deeper process, one that has been shaping you without your permission and, until now, without your awareness. Your mind is always listening. It does not take breaks. It does not filter for truth or usefulness. It simply receives what you feed it through the thoughts you repeat, the images you dwell on, and the feelings you attach to both. Every time you tell yourself, even silently, that you are not the kind of person who handles pressure well, your mind records the statement as an instruction. Every time you replay a past disappointment and add the quiet conclusion that you should have known better, the mind accepts that conclusion as part of its operating map. Over months and years, these small recordings accumulate. They form the background against which you interpret new experiences. They influence what you notice and what you overlook. They shape the tone of the voice you use when you talk to yourself after a setback. None of this requires your conscious agreement. The mind does not need you to believe the thought for it to begin acting on it. It only needs you to keep thinking it. Consider the story of a man named Marcus who spent 12 years in the same mid-sized company. Marcus was competent, well-liked, and consistently produced good work. Yet whenever a leadership opportunity appeared, something inside him would tighten. He would hear a familiar internal voice observe that people who grew up the way he did rarely ended up running teams. He never argued with the voice. He simply accepted its observation as accurate and continued doing what felt natural. He volunteered for supporting roles rather than lead ones. He prepared thorough notes for meetings but rarely offered the first idea. When his manager once suggested he apply for a director position, Marcus smiled and said he was happy where he was. The truth was simpler. His mind had been listening for years to a quiet but persistent story that told him leadership belonged to a different category of person. Because the story felt true, Marcus never examined it. Because he never examined it, his behavior kept confirming it. Promotions went to others. His salary plateaued. His colleagues described him as steady and reliable, which was exactly how his mind had learned to see him. The listening had become the living. What makes this process so powerful is that it operates without drama. There is no single moment when the mind suddenly decides to limit you. There is only the steady accumulation of thoughts that eventually feel like facts. You might recognize this in your own life if you pause and consider an area where you have consistently held back. Perhaps it is speaking in groups, asking for more money, pursuing a creative project, or setting clear boundaries in a relationship. In each case, the surface reason often sounds reasonable. You tell yourself you are being practical or that the timing is not right. Yet beneath those reasons lies an older recording that your mind has been playing on repeat. The recording does not need to be loud to be effective. It only needs to remain unquestioned. As we move deeper into these ideas, it becomes essential to see how the stories you carry about yourself end up writing the actual script of your days. These stories are not neutral descriptions. They are active forces. They tell your mind what to expect, what to protect against, and what to reach for. Once a story takes hold, it begins to filter every new piece of information so that only the parts that fit the story remain visible. Everything else is explained away or simply not noticed. The result is that your life starts to match the story with remarkable precision, not because the story was accurate in the first place, but because the mind has become skilled at making it come true. Take the example of a woman named Laura who had carried since childhood a quiet but unshakable narrative that people like her were meant to live ordinary lives. Her parents had been kind and stable. They had worked hard, paid their bills, and spoken often about the dangers of wanting too much. Laura absorbed the message not as advice but as identity. By the time she reached her 30s, she had a good job, a small circle of friends, and a comfortable apartment. On the surface, everything appeared fine. Yet whenever an opportunity for something larger appeared, whether a chance to relocate for work or an invitation to join a more ambitious professional circle, Laura would find a reason to decline. She would tell herself that she was not the kind of person who took big risks. She would remind herself that she had never been especially lucky. Each time she chose the smaller path, the story gained another layer of confirmation. Her life remained safe and predictable, exactly as the story had predicted. What Laura did not see was that the story itself was the cause, not the description. The narrative had become a self-reinforcing loop. Her mind listened to it, her choices honored it, and her results proved it true. You may notice something familiar in Laura's pattern. Many people carry stories that sound modest and realistic on the surface, yet quietly cap what they allow themselves to reach for. The story might be about what kind of person deserves success, or what kind of background leads to certain outcomes, or what happens to people who try to stand out. Once the story is in place, the mind treats it as a map. It stops presenting options that fall outside the map. It stops generating the energy required to pursue those options. The person then concludes that the limits are simply part of reality, rather than the result of an unchallenged internal narrative. This is how a story that began as a thought becomes the shape of an entire life. To understand why these stories exert such lasting power, we need to look at how beliefs themselves are actually formed. Beliefs rarely arrive as fully formed conclusions. They are assembled piece by piece through experiences that carry emotional weight, through repetition that makes certain ideas feel familiar, and through environments that reward some ways of seeing the world while discouraging others. A single emotional event can plant a seed. Years of small, repeated messages can water it until it grows into something that feels permanent. The mind does not require logical proof. It requires emotional consistency. Once a belief has enough emotional consistency behind it, the mind begins to treat it as a fact about the world rather than a conclusion drawn from past experience. Consider the early life of a boy named Thomas. Thomas was sensitive by nature. He felt things deeply and sometimes cried easily when he was young. His father, a man who had learned to survive by keeping his own feelings tightly controlled, repeatedly told Thomas that the world had no patience for sensitive boys. Each time Thomas showed emotion, his father would say the same words with a mixture of concern and frustration. Over time, Thomas learned to associate his natural sensitivity with weakness and danger. He began to hide his feelings, to speak less, to choose activities that did not require him to stand out. By adolescence, the belief had hardened into something Thomas no longer questioned. He simply knew that he was the kind of person who needed to stay in the background. The original messages had come from outside. The repetition and the emotional charge had moved him inside. What began as his father's discomfort had become Thomas's own internal rule about what was safe and what was possible. You can see similar patterns in your own history if you are willing to look. Perhaps there was a teacher who implied you were not particularly talented in a certain subject. Perhaps there was a group of peers who made you feel that your interests were strange. Perhaps there were family conversations that repeatedly framed success as something that happened to other kinds of people. None of these moments needed to be dramatic to be formative. They only needed to arrive when your mind was still building its basic map of how the world worked. Once the map was drawn, later experiences were interpreted through it. The belief did not need to be true. It only needed to be repeated often enough and felt strongly enough to become the lens through which you saw yourself. These beliefs do not remain as abstract thoughts. They become invisible prisons that shape the decisions you make without ever announcing themselves as limitations. A belief such as, "I cannot handle difficult conversations," does not simply sit in your mind as an idea. It influences whether you speak up when something matters to you. It affects how your body feels when conflict appears. It determines whether you prepare thoroughly for a meeting or quietly hope it will pass without requiring you to assert yourself. The prison is invisible because the belief feels like a description of reality rather than a rule you once accepted. You do not say to yourself, "I am choosing not to ask for what I want because of an old belief." You simply notice that asking feels uncomfortable and conclude that you are not the kind of person who asks. A woman named Elena discovered this pattern only after years of watching promising opportunities slip away. Elena had developed a deep conviction that she always found a way to ruin good situations. The conviction had grown from a handful of painful experiences in her 20s when relationships and jobs had ended badly. Each ending had carried the same internal conclusion. She had done something wrong. She had not been enough. Over time, the conclusion stopped being attached to specific events and became a general rule about her. When a new relationship began to feel promising, Elena would become anxious and start looking for signs that it was about to go wrong. When a manager praised her work, she would wonder how long it would take before she made a mistake that changed their opinion. The belief did not prevent her from having good moments. It simply ensured that she could never fully trust them. She would pull back, overthink, or create distance before anything could be taken from her. The pattern felt like self-protection. In reality, it was the belief operating exactly as it had been programmed to operate. Elena was not unlucky in love or work. She was consistently acting in ways that made the belief come true. The most difficult part of this entire process is that most people never recognize the programming at all. They experience the results of their beliefs as personality traits or as unchangeable facts about who they are. They say things like, "I have always been this way," or "I am just not good at that sort of thing," without ever asking where the limitation originated or whether it still needs to be true. The programming becomes invisible precisely because it feels so familiar. It blends into the background of daily life until it is simply the way things are. A person who avoids risks does not see themselves as someone operating from a belief about safety. They see themselves as cautious by nature. A person who struggles to receive compliments does not trace the discomfort back to early messages about humility or worth. They simply know that praise feels awkward and move on. The confusion between programming and personality is what keeps the old patterns in place for decades. You can observe this confusion in the story of a man named Brian, who had spent most of his adult life describing himself as someone who was simply not good with people. Brian worked in a technical field where he could spend long stretches of time alone with his work. He told himself and others that he preferred it that way, and social events felt draining. Small talk felt pointless. He had accepted this as a fixed part of his character. What Brian did not remember clearly was how the belief had begun. As a child, he had been awkward in groups and had once been publicly corrected by a teacher for saying something that made the other children laugh at him. The embarrassment had been sharp. In the weeks that followed, Brian had started watching his words more carefully. He had begun to believe that speaking up carried a high risk of looking foolish. By adulthood, the original event was long forgotten, yet the rule remained. Brian did not see himself as someone who had learned to avoid social risk. He saw himself as someone who had never been socially skilled to begin with. The programming had become his personality in his own eyes. The encouraging truth is that what was assembled through repetition, an emotional weight, can be disassembled through the same mechanisms. Your mind remains capable of forming new recordings. It can learn to treat new thoughts as instructions just as readily as it once treated the old ones. The process does not require you to pretend that the past never happened. It requires you to stop treating the past conclusions as permanent. You begin by noticing the belief when it appears. You examine where it came from and whether the evidence that created it still applies to the life you are living now. You then deliberately introduce a different thought, one that is supported by small, consistent actions that generate new evidence. Over time, the new thought gathers its own emotional weight. The mind begins to listen to it with the same automatic acceptance it once gave to the older recording. A woman named Anna experienced this shift after years of believing she was simply not someone who could speak in front of groups. The belief had formed in school when a presentation had gone poorly and classmates had teased her afterward. Anna had carried the conclusion into adulthood, declining every opportunity that required her to present ideas publicly. When she finally decided to examine the belief, she realized that the original incident had involved a topic she knew nothing about and an audience of peers who were not particularly kind. She also noticed that in small meetings, she often explained complex ideas clearly and that people listened. The difference was not ability. The difference was the story she had attached to the larger setting. Anna began a deliberate practice. She volunteered to share updates in small team meetings. She prepared thoroughly and then focused on the value of what she was sharing rather than on how she might appear. Each time the experience went reasonably well, she made a point of registering the outcome instead of dismissing it. Over several months, the old belief lost its automatic power. New evidence had accumulated. The mind had begun to listen to a different set of instructions. This same process applies to any belief that has been quietly directing your choices. The work is not dramatic. It is steady. You notice, you question, you introduce new thoughts supported by new actions. You repeat until the new way of seeing yourself feels as natural as the old one once did. The mind does not resist this process when it is done with patience rather than force. It simply begins to record what you now give it most consistently. With this understanding of how beliefs are formed, how they become invisible prisons, and how they can be rewritten, you have the foundation needed for the deeper work that lies ahead. In the next part of this audiobook, we will move from seeing the old programming to actively constructing a new sense of who you are and what you are capable of becoming. The recordings that have shaped you until now do not have to remain the only recordings your mind ever hears. You are ready to begin choosing what comes next. Now that you understand how old beliefs were formed and how they can be rewritten, we can move into the active process of building something new. The first idea we will explore together is the identity shift, and why this shift in how you see yourself must come before any lasting changes appear in your results or circumstances. Most people approach change by trying to alter their behavior while still carrying the same old sense of who they are. They want new outcomes, yet continue to think of themselves as the person who has always struggled in that area. The mind registers this inconsistency as a kind of internal conflict. It resists the new behaviors because they do not match the deeper story it has been protecting for years. When identity changes first, everything else begins to align naturally. The behaviors stop feeling like forced effort and start feeling like simple expressions of the person you have decided to become. Consider again the story of Marcus, the man who had spent years believing he was not the kind of person who could lead. After he began to question that old recording, something subtle yet powerful started to happen. He did not wait for a promotion or an official title before he changed how he saw himself. Instead, he began to practice the thought that he was someone who could step forward when a situation required steady guidance. At first, the thought felt unfamiliar. He noticed a quiet resistance each time he repeated it. Yet he kept returning to it, especially in moments when he would have previously stayed silent. He started offering to summarize next steps in meetings. He began asking clarifying questions that helped the whole group move forward. None of these actions were dramatic on their own. What mattered was that they were coming from a new identity rather than from a desire to impress anyone. Over several months, his colleagues began to treat him differently. They turned to him more often. When a leadership opening finally appeared, Marcus was no longer surprised to be considered. The external result arrived only after the internal shift had already taken place. His story illustrates a pattern that repeats across many lives. Identity is the soil in which new results grow. Change the soil first, and the growth becomes almost inevitable. As we continue, the next idea we will explore is how to think like the person you want to become. This involves learning to make decisions from the perspective of your future self rather than from the limitations of your current self. Many people set goals while still thinking from inside their old identity. They ask what the person they are today would do, and then they wonder why progress feels so difficult. Successful individuals often operate differently. They have learned to step into the mind of the version of themselves that has already achieved what they desire. They ask what that future person would choose in the present moment. This simple shift in perspective changes the quality of their daily decisions. It reduces the pull of short-term comfort because the future self values long-term outcomes more clearly. Take the example of a woman named Rachel who had always dreamed of building something meaningful of her own. For years, she thought about her future business from the perspective of the person she was right now, someone who felt uncertain and underqualified. Each time an opportunity to learn a new skill appeared, she hesitated because the current version of her could list many reasons why she was not ready. One day, she began a different practice. Every morning, she spent a few quiet minutes imagining herself as the woman who had already created the life she wanted. She asked what that version of herself would read, how she would spend her first hour of the day, and what she would say no to in order to protect her focus. The answers surprised her. The future Rachel was not constantly busy. She was selective. She invested time in relationships that mattered and declined invitations that scattered her energy. When Rachel started making decisions from that perspective, her calendar began to change. She enrolled in a course she had been postponing for months. She reached out to someone she had admired from a distance. None of these steps felt heroic. They simply felt consistent with the person she was becoming. Over time, the gap between her current self and her future self narrowed because she was no longer waiting to become that person. She was already thinking as that person in the present. The next idea we will explore is the power of mental rehearsal. and how it allows you to strengthen new patterns before they ever appear in your outer life. Your mind does not always distinguish clearly between a vividly imagined experience and a real one. When you rehearse a desired behavior or outcome with emotional detail, the same neural pathways that would activate during the actual event begin to fire. This is not wishful thinking. It is a form of mental conditioning that prepares your mind and body to perform more naturally when the real moment arrives. Athletes have used this approach for decades. They visualize not only the successful outcome, but the precise sensations, the focus, and even the small corrections they might need to make along the way. The same principle applies to any area of life where you want to build confidence and competence. Consider the story of a woman named Olivia who had always felt nervous before important conversations at work. She would prepare her points thoroughly, yet still feel her heart race when the moment came. After learning about mental rehearsal, she began a simple daily practice. Each evening, she would close her eyes and imagine herself in the next day's meeting. She pictured the room, the faces of her colleagues, and the sound of her own voice speaking clearly and calmly. She did not imagine a perfect performance. She imagined herself pausing when she needed to gather her thoughts, recovering smoothly when a question caught her off guard, and staying connected to the purpose of the conversation rather than to her own nervousness. She repeated this rehearsal several times, each time adding more sensory detail. When the actual meeting occurred, something felt different. Her body remembered the calm she had practiced. Her mind had already walked the path. The nervousness was still present, yet it no longer controlled her. She spoke with greater steadiness because part of her had already experienced the steadiness she wanted. Mental rehearsal had shortened the distance between the person she was and the person she was becoming. As we move forward, let us look at what happens when you begin to act as if the new identity is already true. This does not mean pretending or forcing behaviors that feel completely foreign. It means allowing your actions to express the identity you have chosen, even when those actions still feel slightly unfamiliar. Human beings learn who they are partly through what they do. When you consistently behave in ways that align with a new sense of self, your mind receives fresh evidence that the new identity is valid. The awkwardness of the early stages gradually gives way to naturalness because repetition builds familiarity. What once required conscious effort begins to feel like second nature. A man named Daniel discovered this principle after years of seeing himself as someone who avoided difficult conversations. He had told himself that conflict made him too uncomfortable to handle well. When he decided to shift his identity towards someone who could speak honestly, even when it felt tense, he knew he could not simply wait until he felt ready. He began with small acts of honesty in low-stakes situations. He told a friend when a plan did not work for him instead of agreeing out of habit. He expressed a differing opinion in a casual discussion at work. Each time he acted from the new identity, he noticed two things. First, the world did not end. Second, a quiet sense of self-respect began to grow. The more he acted in alignment with the person he wanted to be, the less he needed to convince himself that he could handle difficult moments. His actions were teaching his mind a new truth about who he was. The transformation did not happen overnight. It happened through the steady accumulation of moments in which he chose to behave as the newer version of himself. The next idea we will explore is how small wins build evidence for a new identity and how that evidence creates momentum over time. When you begin to act from a new identity, the results are rarely dramatic at first. You may notice only minor differences in how you feel or how others respond. These small differences matter enormously because they serve as proof. Each small win tells your mind that the new way of seeing yourself is working. This proof reduces the internal resistance that old beliefs once created. Momentum builds not because you suddenly become a different person, but because the accumulating evidence makes the new identity feel increasingly real and reliable. Take the story of a man named Ryan who had long believed he was someone who could never stick with healthy habits. He had tried many times and always returned to old patterns. When he shifted his identity to someone who takes care of his body as a normal part of life, he did not begin with an extreme overhaul. He started with one small action each day. He drank a glass of water first thing in the morning before checking his phone. He walked for 10 minutes after lunch. He prepared one meal with intention rather than grabbing whatever was convenient. None of these actions felt like they would change his life. Yet each time he completed one, he made a quiet mental note. He registered it as evidence that he was becoming the kind of person who follows through. After several weeks, the evidence had accumulated enough that skipping a day began to feel more uncomfortable than doing the small action. The momentum was not coming from willpower alone. It was coming from the growing body of proof that his new identity was accurate. Small wins had done what large resolutions had never managed. They had changed the story he believed about himself. As we continue, the next idea we will explore is what happens when your thoughts and actions finally align. This alignment creates a compounding effect that accelerates transformation in ways that scattered effort never can. When your internal story and your external behavior point in the same direction, internal conflict decreases. Energy that was once spent managing doubt or explaining away inconsistencies becomes available for forward movement. You stop negotiating with yourself about whether you are capable. You simply move. The compounding occurs because each aligned day adds to the evidence that the new identity is not only possible, but natural. Over time, this creates a sense of inevitability. What once felt like hard work begins to feel like the only logical way to live. Consider again the story of Elena, the woman who had carried the belief that she always found a way to ruin good situations. After she began rewriting that belief and acting from a new identity of someone who could receive and sustain good things, her life started to change in quiet but meaningful ways. She stopped pulling back when a relationship felt promising. She accepted praise without immediately deflecting. She made plans for the future instead of assuming something would go wrong. At first, these changes required conscious choice. Yet each time her actions matched her new thoughts, something inside her settled. The old fear did not disappear overnight, but it lost its automatic power. When a good opportunity appeared, she no longer spent hours imagining how she might sabotage it. She simply participated in it. The alignment between what she thought about herself and how she behaved created space for trust to grow. Her relationships deepened. Her work improved because she was no longer bracing for disappointment. The compounding effect was not dramatic on any single day. It revealed itself in the gradual sense that life was becoming easier, not because circumstances had changed, but because she had stopped fighting herself. The final idea we will explore together is the day you stop doubting yourself. This is not a day that arrives because someone else convinces you of your worth. It arrives when the accumulated evidence from your new identity, your aligned actions, and your mental rehearsals becomes so consistent that doubt no longer has anything solid to stand on. The moment is often quiet rather than dramatic. You may be in the middle of an ordinary day when you notice that an old fear has lost its grip. You may hear yourself speak or make a decision and realize that the voice of doubt is simply not present. This moment feels like coming home to yourself. It is the point at which self-trust stops being something you are trying to build and becomes something you already possess. A man named Brian, who had spent years believing he was simply not good with people, reached this day after months of deliberate practice. He had shifted his identity, rehearsed calmer interactions in his mind, and taken small actions that proved he could connect when he chose to. One afternoon, he found himself in a conversation that would have once left him anxious and eager to escape. He noticed his body remained relaxed. He noticed he was actually listening rather than planning his exit. When the conversation ended, He did not immediately replay it looking for mistakes. He simply moved on to the next part of his day. Later that evening, he realized something had changed. The old story about not being good with people no longer felt true. It felt like a description of someone he used to be. The doubt had not been argued away. It had been outlived. Brian had reached the day when he could trust himself because he had given his mind enough new experiences to believe in. That day did not mark the end of growth. It marked the beginning of a different kind of freedom. The freedom to keep becoming without the constant need to prove himself to himself. As we come to the close of this part of the audiobook, I want to thank you for the time and attention you have given these ideas. You have stayed with each step, from understanding old programming to witnessing the quiet power of identity shifting, mental rehearsal, aligned action, and the gradual building of self-trust. Take a moment now to notice which parts of what you have heard feel most alive in your own experience. Perhaps there is one belief you are ready to examine, or one small action you sense would begin to build new evidence for the person you are becoming. These ideas are not meant to remain interesting thoughts. They are meant to become living choices. If the words you have heard have touched something real inside you, I invite you to like this video so that others searching for the same understanding can find it too. Subscribe to the channel if you want to continue this journey with future audiobooks that will build on what we have explored here. And if someone in your life comes to mind, someone who has been carrying an old story that no longer needs to define them, consider sharing this audiobook with them. Another life-changing audiobook is already prepared and waiting for you in our next video, ready to guide you further into the process of becoming who you truly are. Remember that the person you are becoming does not require you to become someone entirely new. That person is already present in the choices you make when you think from a place of greater possibility. You have heard how identity shifts before results, how thinking from your future self changes present decisions, how mental rehearsal prepares the ground, and how small aligned actions create unstoppable momentum. Most of all, you have seen that the day you stop doubting yourself arrives not as a sudden gift, but as the natural result of giving your mind consistent new evidence. Carry these understandings with you. Let them shape the thoughts you choose today and the actions you take tomorrow. You are not starting from nothing. You are continuing from everything you have already become ready to release and everything you are now ready to claim. The next chapter of your story is already being written in the quiet space between one thought and the next. What you choose to think now will determine who you become next.